Hey everyone.
What's up,
Appreciate
everybody?
really appreciate everybody setting aside some time and especially sticking with us as we navigate some technical difficulties getting live. But you have joined the right spot if you're looking to hang out with us and work through the session Automate Everything. And we're going to cover some common use cases that folks will utilize FormAssembly for to better capture data, as well as make sure that that data is actionable and ending up in the right spot to power the right business critical processes. Now, we have a few different things that we'll work through today, and I want to make sure that we have the slides coming through. So, of course, if you don't see some slides here shortly, let us know. And of course, we'll always have a playback of the webinar sent over to you. And if there's any information or questions you have that we don't get to today, definitely reach out to Taj or myself. We're going to be following up with everybody, making sure that all this information is helpful and that, again, we follow up and build on this however needed. Perfect. Before we get started, I'll make sure that we introduce ourselves. I'm Justin Benton from the sales team at FormAssembly. I actually work with both existing customers and new customers, though most often new customers. So I've seen a little bit of everything when it comes to how folks will utilize FormAssembly, and especially when it comes to what are the use cases and common core problems inside of those use cases that are just going to be present that everybody's dealing with when it comes to web forms. And I'll pass the mic over to you, Taj.
Hello, yes, welcome. I am Taj, and I am pretty much here to, co-present with Justin for FormAssembly. This is my first webinar for FormAssembly, so I'm super excited. So don't be surprised by my monotone voice. I actually am excited underneath this monotone voice. I am just making sure everything goes well. Hey, Justin, why did the chicken cross the road?
You got me.
Because FormAssembly was on the other side. All right, so I'm just going to pass it back to Justin. If you guys have any questions, ask in the chat, and we are happy to help you there. I will be covering any questions and answers. So,
Awesome. Thanks, Taj. And again, any questions that you have, drop them in the chat at any point. We'll try and get to as many as we can as we navigate the agenda today. But we'll also make sure, as you notice, there's going to be some time at the end that if there's any questions that pop up, as we anticipate at least a few as we go through these use cases, we'll make sure to cover them because we're going to take a look at a few of those use cases, those common challenges, and then obviously how FormAssembly addresses those challenges for different customers in different contexts. But then also we're going to take a live look at some of the specific areas in those use cases that really drive home a lot of impact for folks, whether it's going to be in how it connects to Salesforce or other systems, or just in how you utilize FormAssembly alone to drive the automation that's needed so the full process comes to life. Perfect. We'll go ahead and jump into our list of use cases, which today we're going to take a look at customer onboarding forms, net promoter score surveys, and then complex application processes. And the first one being that customer onboarding forms. This is something where anybody that takes in customers, new accounts, or something similar is going to be constantly dealing with a variety of information as they take on what is now a full account, because there's going to be different information for every company, and it usually exists in a few different ways. In fact, if we jump to that next slide, we'll see some of the biggest problems that we'll face with onboarding new customers, which is usually going to be repeat data needing to be captured throughout the process, because there's going to be data that's captured before they're ever a customer, at the time of becoming a customer, and at some point down the line after they're officially a customer, that can cause respondents to sometimes have to fill out the same questions, or sometimes they'll end up giving you information inconsistently, or causing something to be ineffective in the way that you utilize the data. In fact, essentially, there's often multiple Salesforce objects involved as well, and that's because a new customer comes in usually through an opportunity of some type or through some sales process that you track, and they, as a customer, are an account or something similar that contains contacts or has all types, and usually sometimes very specific types, in most cases with Salesforce, of data and data structures. And without having that full story, the relationships that go with all the data, you don't have the same effectiveness and the same impact. So capturing not just the data, but how it exists across all the different objects in the schema and the relationships of those is really where the impact lies. And then, of course, it's also just going to be large amounts of data that maybe more than one person filling out at any given time. Now, when we have all those different like blurred lines in those processes, oftentimes that's going to be a friction point where something can fall apart or just stall out entirely, where somebody maybe doesn't know when they're supposed to jump in or with what information, causing them to either answer something they shouldn't have ever been even looking at, or worse, possibly worse, not answering something at all. And again, leaving it just kind of standing in the water for the time being. But this next slide here is going to walk through a few ways that FormAssembly users navigate these challenges by, obviously taking that existing Salesforce data, pre-filling it into a form. You can alleviate a respondent's need to have to provide the same data over and over. And if anything, you can help them maintain and manage their data, as if they were logging into your Salesforce instance with all the guidelines and permissions, Overwatch and everything that you would need for them to do so. Because that's exactly what a form does. It brings the necessary Salesforce data to your respondent into the form, lets them manage, review, do whatever they need, and then push the right data back, all based on how you configure that. Or you can do things like start connecting the dots across those relationships, across the different objects, because when somebody hits submit on a form, you don't just need a form to be filled out. If somebody's trying to set up a new customer onboarding process, you might need them to hit submit and then update an opportunity, update a contact, update multiple contacts, update an account, or any range or combination of obviously different objects in Salesforce. And then lastly, you're going to be able to create the ideal user experience for the respondent so that they can maybe save and resume at any point in time. They can kick this process over to somebody else that should be filling it out instead, have some review for themselves if they want to be able to look over answers before they ever submit, or just maybe do something like create additional approvals internally to where, it's going to go to Salesforce, but not until some additional eyes get on it to make sure that the data is always looking how it should, or you're only accepting certain data. I always say we're working backwards here because that's the goal, is what's the end outcome of these processes and how do we get the forms and the data that you're collecting to get there. We'll take a look at this a little more in a second, but we also have Net Promoter Score surveys as a very common use case that folks will utilize FormAssembly for. And that's because there's some problems that pop up around the way that you gain insight into the performance and analytics of a Net Promoter Score survey. And that's going to be true for any form process, but especially for something like this, to where the real impact of a Net Promoter Score survey is going to be in the ongoing analysis and insight of, okay, what am I getting back? Are the scores today better than yesterday? Because that's the trend information that I need coming off of something like a Net Promoter Score survey. And if you don't have that, usually you're relying on possibly skewed outcomes, or you're just entirely in the dark, because it doesn't matter if I have a ton of responses, last month, if they're entirely different from my responses this month, because that could be a trend that I'm now ignoring. Or I could be in the dark if I'm sending this out to 100 folks, or I need responses from 100 respondents, and I'm only getting 50 back, because often I might be missing the responses that I need the most. Often this is going to be really critical and intricately impactful for other business processes and teams. And that's because how somebody fills this out just can determine a ton of different actions in terms of what comes next, or who needs to be involved when this is finished, or when the next step comes into play. And not being able to initiate these can oftentimes, again, we mentioned before, create friction or just create a stall entirely. And the last thing you want in a scenario like a response or follow-up for a Net Promoter Score survey response is something to be stalled out, because again, the meat and impact of what we're doing here is interactions, and we want feedback from folks. So the ability to take that feedback and utilize it is the only way you're ever going to continue getting that type of feedback from respondents moving forward. Scoring also can get really complex with these. And that's just a nature of the beast, for Net Promoter Score surveys, because you want to capture very specific data and you want to understand, very, intimately the type of feedback that you're getting, which often requires working through a lot of numbers and calculations in ways that certain platforms just aren't able to do. And that often forces folks to capture data that's more raw, not ready to use, send that over to Salesforce, have additional automation, or sometimes have to send it off to a spreadsheet and have somebody manually jump in and manage that before it can ever truly be analyzed or valuable data ready to use. But some of the ways that folks will obviously use FormAssembly to address these, on that next slide, we'll see these are going to be analytics that are ready to take a look at out of box. And that's because FormAssembly provides a ton of different insights for you, not just in the form responses that you get and the ability to export those and create like custom reports out of your responses, but also in the form's performance itself. Because again, if you're sending this to 100 people but only getting 50 responses back, there's 50 sets of data that you have no insight into, and you don't even know that you don't have most of the time. So the ability to have out-of-box analytics is really powerful for folks, but also the ability to support analytics, whether it's something like Google Analytics for certain types of tracking, or if you want to power analytics processes inside of Salesforce. I've seen some really interesting stuff, and sky is usually the limit when it comes to tracking things through FormAssembly. You can also map out custom pathways for the different responses that you're going to get. Because again, if I'm filling out a survey like this and I score something that's the worst possible score versus the best possible score, I would anticipate probably some different follow-up, some different interaction based on that. And the reason why you ask those questions and capture that data is because you want to have different follow-up and different actions, whether it's going to be internal or external, and how you interact with the respondent, and usually both. And so we can start kicking off those steps and mapping out what needs to come next and how do we work backwards from the right outcome as soon as somebody clicks submit on a form. And we can also really take that complex scoring and make it simple. So it doesn't matter if you have 5 questions or 50 questions, and it doesn't matter how nested or dependent upon one another these questions are, or how many different scenarios a respondent might have when they enter the survey. You can have calculation that's ready to run for any form experience for any person that's filling this out, so that again, you get data that's actionable, ready to use the second they hit submit. And the last use case that we'll take a look at is going to be complex applications, any type of new account application, student applications. This is going to be anything where similar to customer onboarding, but more on an individual level. We're going to see folks that as a single user oftentimes have to put in a ton of data, and it may be just really intense data when it comes to things I'm not commonly interacting with. We all fill out forms daily, but it's not often that we're filling out forms that require things like a driver's license, things, proof of insurance, various types of file uploads, sensitive data, possibly like social security information, or I have to also have information on maybe a spouse or a dependent or financial information, things that aren't passing through my head as often. So that can be a tough experience for folks that oftentimes has them maybe just not filling out the form. They're going to close it out or save it for another time when I feel like I can really sit down and do all this. And these are also really unique processes because similar to the surveys that we just looked at, there may be a different, dozen different ways that folks interact with this form or need different follow-up based on how they've interacted with the form, which just creates those friction points, those stall points, as well as it makes it difficult to have the customer experience that you're looking for most times. And then lastly, the data has to get to a very unique spot, a very specific spot to be considered actionable. And oftentimes this requires some unique steps like document generation, especially whenever we have things like, applications for financial service customers or folks that are working with maybe banking accounts that are being opened up. This is something to where I'm going to need to not just take this in, but now I need to ship this off to another entity, whether it's going to be Charles Schwab or something similar. And so I'm possibly taking in a form, but also filling one out myself. And so I'll need to have very unique formats. Otherwise, I have to get hands-on in getting that data to be actionable. And that next slide over will walk us through how all of these are super easily addressed. Because FormAssembly users are able to, again, pre-fill data from Salesforce and provide options like saving and resuming your progress in a form. So that way a respondent can always see what they've captured, review and edit as needed, but then also keep a rolling progress through their experience that never has them looking at a form response like, okay, this is going to take me all day. They can break it up as needed, and you can also capture that data however you want along the way. You can also build out those workflows to be as dynamic as needed, both going into the form, how the form operates, and then of course, when it comes to the next steps, once they hit submit, because those subsequent actions usually look like, hey, I need to initiate document generation of a full, again, complex 11-page or 12-page financial application based on what they filled out, based on some other info that I have, all into a template that's going to get built out and then routed to them for e-signature. Because without that, you just have a form response, which is only part of the process. I know I probably just threw a lot of folks. That was a lot of talking. So now it's time for me to do a lot of showing. And we're going to walk through these different use cases. Taking a look at my screen, I will go ahead and share through. Perfect. And the first one we're going to take a look at is going to be the onboarding form here. So, obviously, if you see my head shift over, I have the couple screens going on. But the first thing that I want to pull up in an onboarding form is what somebody's going to see when they interact with it. Because as we talked about, this is going to be a lot of information, folks. So if I look at just the form itself, it's now immediately broken up into a few different pages. It's going to help me better understand what I'm looking at, keep me aware of my progress with the progress bar. But let's close out here. Instead of looking at just the form, how would this come to life inside of a full workflow? Because what we really want to see is when somebody interacts with this, how do we pull that data in from Salesforce? How does that pull into a form and then allow them to submit that form or maybe save it based on where they are? And then have the right actions from there going into Salesforce. So if I were to copy this, and what we're doing with this is going to add a parameter into the URL, which will allow us to pre-fill some data. Now I'm only pre-filling over in this scenario the account name. And of course, there's other ways that we can create a user experience that speeds things up for them, like having address autofill along the way, having that map over. And any of this data could have been pushed over from Salesforce. And like we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of objects that are going to come into play with the Salesforce relationship. And that might be the ability to say, you know what, I have 3 folks that I'm going to need to add to this form as I'm onboarding. And this person can sign things. This person can sign and complete POs or whatever it is. And now we're building out that internal account map with all the power being in the customer's hands. And they're letting you have the right data on day one, instead of this being an ongoing collection process 6 months after they've become a new customer. And once somebody hits submit on this, I do want to call out that we go back to build and take a look at that Salesforce connector. There's a lot going on, but it is so easy to set up because there's 4 total steps here. And what I'm saying is I need to update the account that I've interacted with already. So we're going to grab an account ID field from the form that's pre-filled and map that over so that we know we have the right account. Based on that, we can grab a contact, have that be dependent here, and start creating additional contacts like we just saw in the form. But what if we want to also start creating campaign members and start maybe hard coding specific campaigns, or obviously doing it dynamic in different ways, and then using things like the variables from the contact that we just created? Because as we create this, we can always bring the data back from Salesforce, because there is that song and dance, that back and forth of, again, what makes this meaningful is understanding that I don't just have a new contact based on how the form was filled out. I now have somebody that I need to go ahead and throw in a campaign because, hey, I didn't know you worked at this account. You are a new customer and you're a new contact to meet the new customer, or whatever the process is. You're now one step closer to working backwards from that end result. Similarly, if we look at the Net Promoter Score processes, we'll look at the form itself. And it's going to be a standard form, obviously, with the survey built out. But let me actually launch the form for that view again. Because like we mentioned, there's a lot of times that we'll have simple versus complex forms, and there's some level of sacrifice inside of these surveys. Because what if I have 50 questions versus 5? Or what happens if as I'm filling this out, let's actually put a name here. What if some folks have 3 questions, some folks have more, or you have a variety of experiences on the side here? What I want to call out is these scores would usually be hidden, but I have them visible for us to look at today because we would start seeing things like how this scores up, not just on a single section, but also how we can drive very, very dependent calculations so that it doesn't matter how many I've selected. If I have one of these, now my score is, I think I selected the wrong one. Yeah, there we go. But I have 12 because I've only selected one. We're not dividing by the number of sections I have. Whereas if I were to grab 2 of these and start scoring out, I can get really specific on the output that I need, not just the experience, without sacrifice. So that way, when somebody hits submit on this, I'm now able to drive the conditional experience that I need that says, you know what, they hit submit and their final score was 14 or higher. That's great. 14 out of 15, that means I need to have these actions occur. Or it was between, 13 and 10, and these are just set up by me jumping in and saying that form field of final score and then using the operator. But now I'm having, again, getting at least one step closer, and often much more, but to that outcome that I need, to that end result that I'm working backwards from, which is the whole reason why I ever collected one of these responses in the first place. And then lastly, we'll take a look at the application process, because when we have these complex applications, I'll take a quick look at that form as well, where we'll have things that are broken down. And like we saw, we can break this into multiple pages, or we can break this into conditional sections where if I were to start building this out and then make a selection here, then I can get different fields versus if I were to select this, then I might get something else as well. But I also mentioned earlier, what do we do with different types of data when somebody's filling this out? Because how do I know that, you're doing something different with my social security number versus anything else? And you notice there's some formatting that we already have here that guides me through what's needed. Doesn't allow me to enter anything else. I can't even enter letters. And then of course, there's going to be back-end controls for you to keep this secure, but there's different ways to guide folks through what's needed through this process. So that way, if I'm uploading something different every time, I can have different guidance or different controls. Or maybe you want to have different controls on the type of file that can be uploaded. And then of course, once this is all submitted, there's a lot that needs to go down. Because if I were to jump back into that workflow, that form's filled out, they're redirected, but now we're sending things off to Salesforce. And we're not just updating a single contact. This is where we might start now having attachments sent over. We're creating files that are related to the other records that we're interacting with. Now that we've seen how to do that, what do we do with the next steps, which are going to be, I need to generate a document. And this is where I can come in and upload something like a Word doc or a PowerPoint doc that has tags listed out. So you'll see right here that tag of like first name, and I can build out whatever I want as long as it's one of those 2 formats to create any custom dynamic document with data pulling over from the form response. And then once I have that document set up, I can always route for e-signature as well. It's going to be a similar tagging process. If I were to select that, then I would just have the document that I previously used, tag it out, and then I can route for signature. And again, I'm now steps closer to what I truly needed to have happen once somebody hits submit on that form. Now, I know we ran a little over. Again, I appreciate everybody joining today and appreciate you sticking through the technical difficulties as we got started. And definitely reach out to us if you have any questions. It looks like we may not have time for Q&A today, but drop those here and we'll make sure to follow up with those questions via email. And also reach out to us. There should be some links there to get in touch, but we'll make sure that if there's any information that you want to see from today that wasn't covered or any questions that you have that we didn't get a chance to answer, that we get that info over to you. Otherwise, I appreciate everybody's time today for sticking with us, and I hope you have a great rest of the Tuesday.
Thank you.